They built a multi-million-dollar power station on my lake, on my father's land, without so much as a polite knock or by your leave, and they did it with this sickening sense of entitlement like they were doing the world a favor. The Clear Creek Homeowners Association called it, green progress, community resource sharing, but where I come from, we have a much shorter word for it, and that's theft. I warned them, I really did. I sat in those stuffy meetings with my folders full of yellowing deeds and original plat maps, showing them exactly where the property line fell, but they just looked at me with that patronizing, we know better, smile while they sharpen their shears. So, at exactly 1 minute past midnight, I walked down to the water's edge through the damp grass, fitted the iron crank my father left me 50 years ago into a rusted slot hidden beneath a concrete slab, and I literally pulled the plug on their entire project. By the time the sun started peeking over the ridge, their precious power grid was a pile of useless metal sitting in a graveyard of mud, and justice finally arrived with the sound of millions of gallons of water vanishing into the dark earth. You see, that lake was never just feature or parcel C like they labeled it in their glossy brochures, because that lake was carved out of the Tennessee clay by my old man, Silas Vance, back when I was just a kid with scraped knees and a fishing pole. He didn't end oppos, just by the land. He engineered it. He spent an entire summer in 1974 behind the controls of a rented backhoe, sweating through his shirts and lining that basin with stone and clay until it held water like a silver bowl. He stocked it with base that grew as big as your forearm, and he passed it down to me, Miller Vance, not like a piece of real estate, but like a sacred trust, something you guard with your life. It was ours legally and irrevocably, etched into the county records since the bicentennial, but apparently that didn't mean a damn thing to the New South types who moved into the Highland subdivision and decided they wanted to play God with the landscape. The first time I saw those pink survey flags, I was out walking my two mutts, Copper and Scout, on a crisp morning when the air still smells like pine and wood smoke. They were stabbing out of the ground along my western shoreline like tiny, fluorescent intruders, and they didn't in oppos. T just marked the edge. They cut a deep, arrogant arc right through my back pasture. I felt that cold knot form in the pit of my stomach, the kind of feeling you get when you know a storm is coming but the sky is still blue, and I remember thinking it had to be a mistake, maybe a utility check or some bored city surveyor who couldn't read a compass. I took photos, sent them to the HOA board, and even copied the city clerk, thinking a little bit of paper trail would clear it up, but the reply I got back was like being slapped with a wet fish. It was signed by Brenda Sterling, the board president, a woman who wore her power like a cheap perfume. And it just said they were initiating a community-wide sustainability enhancement, and that details would be shared when they were good and ready. I've never been a man for meetings, especially the kind where people spend 2 hours arguing about the shade of beige you can paint your garage door, but I showed up to the next one at the community center, feeling like a wolf in a room full of poodles. Brenda was up there at the head table, looking all polished and professional, and when I stood up to ask why there were flags on my deeded land, she gave me this sigh, the kind of teacher gives a slow student. She told the room, right to my face, that they're environmental consultants, had determined the lake was a shared ecosystem and that the Highlands HOA had partnered with a firm called Voltec to build a microhydro station. She called it a, resident-endorsed leap toward energy independence, and when I told her she couldn't in oppos build a birdhouse on my land, let alone a power plant, she just smiled and said there were, discrepancies, and the old maps of the city was helping them, resolve, That was the moment I knew I wasn't in oppos. Fighting a mistake, I was fighting a machine. They weren't looking for the truth, they were looking for a way to steamroll over a, cranky old man, because I was the only thing standing between them and a federal green energy grant. Over the next month, the invasion turned into a full-scale occupation, with diesel trucks rumbling past my house at 5 in the morning and flatbeds unloading crates of turbines and concrete forms right on the edge of my woods. They didn't in oppos. Ask for an easement. They didn't in oppos. Offer a dime. They just acted like I didn't in oppos. Exist, and Every time I tried to talk to the foreman, he just pointed at a piece of paper signed by Brenda and told me to talk to the lawyers. It was personal for them, too. I could see it in the way Brenda would stand on my dock, my father's dock, with her clipboard, pointing at things and laughing with the engineers like she'd already won. But what they didn't in Oppos, T realized, and what Brenda's high-priced consultants failed to find in their fancy digital surveys, was that my father was a man who planned for the worst. He'd seen the floods of the 50s, and when he built that lake, he didn't in Oppos. T just make it pretty. He made it controllable. Buried deep under the silt and the lily pads, at the deepest point of the basin, there was a valve, a massive, heavy-duty emergency release that tied into a reinforced concrete culvert running half a mile downhill into a federally protected wetland catchment. It was a fail-safe, a way to empty the lake in hours if the dam ever looked like it was going to breach, and it was a structure that was grandfathered into the state records long before the HOA even existed. The final straw came on a Tuesday when a courier delivered a certified letter that basically told me I was being, in quote, restricted, in quote, from my own shoreline for, in quote, safety reasons, in quote, during the commissioning of the plant. They had actually put up a fence, a temporary chain-link eyesore that cut me off from the water where I'd scattered my mother's ashes, and they warned me that any, in quote, interference, in quote, would be met with civil and criminal penalties. I sat in my father's old study that night, looking at his hand-drawn engineering schematics, and I realized they had built their heavy, expensive, high-tech power station directly over the intake for the release valve. They were literally sitting on a trapdoor, and they didn't in Oppos to even know it was there. I spent 3 days trying to be the, in quote, good citizen, in quote. One last time calling the EPA, the sheriff, and even the local news, but the HOA had done their homework. They'd tied this project into so many, in quote, green, in quote, initiatives that no one wanted to touch it. The sheriff told me it was a civil matter. The EPA said the project had a, in quote, low impact, in quote, waiver, and the news reporter just wanted to know if I was, in quote, anti-environment, in quote. So I stopped talking. I went out to the shed, found the old iron handle with a leather grip that had been hanging on the same peg for 40 years, and I oiled it until it shone like a new dime. That Sunday night was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air right before a tornado hits. The HOA had a big, in quote, lights on, in quote, celebration scheduled for Monday morning, and they had the plant running on a low idle test mode, the green LEDs on the control barge reflecting off the water like a bad omen. At exactly 11:45 p.m., I walked down the hidden path behind the boathouse, moved a pile of brush I'd been stacking for weeks, and lifted the heavy concrete lid of the valve chamber. The air down there smelled like cold stone and old secrets, and when I slid that handle into the slot, I felt a connection to my father that I can't quite put into words. It was like he was there, his hand on my shoulder, saying, in quote, give an Oppos. Im hell, son, in quote. I didn't in Oppos. T just turn it. I cranked it with every bit of frustration and righteous anger I'd been holding in for months, and I felt the gears groan and then snap into place. Below me, in the dark, the earth started to hum, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that you feel in your teeth more than you hear in your ears. I climbed out, sat on a stump, and watched. At first, it was just a ripple, but then the shoreline started to grow, the water pulling back inch by inch, exposing the muck and the old fishing lures and the things that had been hidden for half a century. By 1 a.m., the barge with the turbines started to groan, the steel cables tightening as the water level dropped 4, 5, 6 feet. By 2 a.m., the barge wasn't in Oppos, T floating anymore. It was listing to one side, its expensive intake pipes buckling under the weight of its own hubris. Around 3 a.m., the neighborhood went dark. See, the, in quote, smart grid, in quote. They were so proud it was designed to sense the water pressure to stay balanced, and when the pressure vanished, the system panicked. It didn't end Oppos. T just shut down. It tripped the main breakers for the whole Highland subdivision, plunging Brenda's Sterling and her, in quote, green, in quote, utopia into a total blackout. I could hear the shouting from across the lake, the beams of flashlights dancing around the mud flats like frantic fireflies, and I just sat there in the dark with my dogs, sipping a thermos of coffee and feeling more at peace than I had in years. When the sun finally came up, It was a massacre of machinery. The lake was gone, replaced by a vast, steaming crater of gray mud, and right in the middle of it was their multi-million-dollar power plant, crumpled like a discarded soda can on the lake bed. Brenda was there, of course, standing in the muck in her designer boots, looking like she wanted to scream at the sky. And when the county inspectors and the EPA guys showed up, I was waiting for them with my folder. I showed them the active registration for the emergency catchment system. I showed them the deed that proved the HOA had built a, in quote, public utility, in quote, on private land without an easement, and I watched the blood drain from the lawyer's face when he realized that they weren't into oppos, the ones in charge anymore. The HOA tried to sue me for, in quote, sabotage, in quote, but you can't sabotage your own registered safety equipment on your own land, and the court eventually told them that if you build a house on a sinkhole, you don't get to blame the sinkhole when it opens up. They had to pay to have every scrap of that metal hauled away. They had to pay to restore my shoreline, and they had to issue a formal written apology in the county paper admitting that the lake was, and always had been, the sole property of the Vance family. But here's the thing that still gets people talking around town, and I want to hear what you all think about it. The HOA board members are still out there, and they're telling anyone who will listen that I'm a, quote, terrorist, and quote, who destroyed a community's future just to prove a point about a piece of dirt. They say that in a world that's burning, one man's property rights shooed into oppos. Outweigh the, in quote, greater good, in quote, of 400 families. I say that if you don into oppos, have the right to hold on to what you built with your own hands, then you don into oppos. Have a community at all, you just have a mob with a better vocabulary. So was I wrong? Should I have just taken the payout they eventually offered and let them have the lake, or is there a line in the sand, or the mud, that you just don into oppos? Let people cross, no matter how, in quote, green, in quote, their intentions are? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I'm the hero of this story or just a bitter man who took things too far, because I've got a feeling this is a conversation that isn't going to end anytime soon.